In this tutorial, we're going to learn how to create an awesome, reusable Markdown editor component. One where you can type and it will automatically update with a live preview. And not only that, but it will do code highlighting and it'll work with Nuxt and other SSR frameworks. As a jumping off point, we're going to start with this simple example in the VueJS docs. We're going to modify it so it works with SSR and within our own app. And that involves installing the marked library and using that to display Markdown. Next, we're going to make the MarkdownDisplay Component so we can easily display Markdown anywhere in our app. Then we're going to add syntax highlighting using highlight.js. And then finally, we're going to put a live preview in our edit screen so that we can see how it looks as we're typing it, how it's going to display. So here in our video description, we already have some dynamic data that's written in Markdown. Our goal in this section is to make it display as it's supposed to. We'll find that code in video ID index, or our admin show page. And here's the line that's currently displaying the code. We're going to replace this line with something that can display Markdown. Step 1 is to install marked. All right, so it's installed, and here we can go ahead and import marked from marked. This will give us the marked function that we saw in the example. We'll just need to feed it our markdown string. So let's go ahead and do a rudimentary version of that. All right, so we'll call this we'll just call it Markdown for now. And we'll return marked, and we'll put in an example string. And so that should show up as an H1. All right, so here, instead of video.description, we will put in our Markdown. All right, it is showing up nicely. Now let's get in the dynamic data that's coming from our video object. So here, instead of feeding it this string directly, we'll get this.video, which is computed here, and then we will get the description. All right, it's working. So you can see we have our header here, we have our italics here, and the paragraphs are in the right place. So that is our first display of Markdown using the marked library. Let's go ahead and make that happen not just for the description, but for the code summary as well. And we'll edit this here so even without the syntax highlighting, which will be required for this, we can still see whether it's in Markdown or not. All right, so let's display that code summary. And we'll display it below the description. All right, so we'll add in an H3 for the code summary, and then without the Markdown, it would just be video.codeSummary. And we'll go and see that it's showing, but it of course is not displaying as Markdown. So let's go ahead and fix that. And we'll need something like this Markdown computed property. We'll call it code summary Markdown. And we'll go ahead and call this description Markdown. And then we'll see that these are indeed showing up. And this is recognized as code, even though it's not highlighted yet. So we've got our Markdown displaying correctly. But there is a little bit of a code smell here. So for every time that we display a Markdown property, we're going to have to create a computed property that runs marked. Oh, and by the way, yes, I have tried using marked here and putting in the data directly without a computed property. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem to like that. And if we add any options to marked, which we'll be doing to turn on code highlighting, then we'll have to repeat those every place we've used it. So that means this is a good candidate for a component. So let's go ahead and create a Markdown display component. And then the basics of it, so there will be a computed property that takes in the Markdown. So we'll have a props that is Markdown, and then we'll return a processed Markdown. And that will return the Markdown processed through marked. And so we'll have to, of course, put our marked import here. And then we will have a div here that displays the processed Markdown. Now let's use this. So we will have to import our Markdown display component from our components folder, and then register it. And then we can use it here. And we'll feed in our Markdown, and for the description, it'll just be video.description. And we can remove that. And let's see if that displays. And yep, it's still displaying correctly as Markdown. Then we can replace the code summary Markdown with the same. And now that means we can delete the marked import, and we can delete these two computed properties, and it'll all still work. Some people may disagree with the decision to encapsulate our code into this component. They may say, you know, those computed properties weren't really that bad, and this is, of course, the exact same amount of lines of code. But this is a place that will collect complexity as we improve and add nuance to our Markdown display. And so it's good to box that complexity up right at the beginning. In this section, we're going to make syntax highlighting work using highlight.js. We'll start off by adding the highlight.js package to our app, and make sure to include the dot in there. Next, we'll go to our Markdown display component and import highlight from highlight.js. So let's go ahead and log this to the console just to show that it has been imported. All right, here we go. And it has methods like highlight, highlight auto, and so on. Highlight auto is what we'll be using today. In the marked documentation, we can see how to apply it. So the second argument is an optional options hash. And one of those options is highlight, which is a function, and it'll return the highlighted code. And this is what they recommend. So let's apply that. So we have the highlight function, and the argument will be the markdown, and then it will return highlight.highlightAuto and apply that to the markdown, and then grab the value from that. So let's see if this is working. We don't see any change to the styling, but there has been some internal change. So it's applied classes like HLJS, highlight.js, string, highlight.js keyword, adder, etc. to the various parts. And so those are the building blocks for highlighting. We can do this by copying this import statement. And so this one will be getting the GitHub styles. So let's go ahead and paste that in here and see what that gives us. So there's a little bit here. So the let keyword has changed to a darker color. The attribute has changed to something more orangish. All right, but I don't really like this style. So let's see if we can get another one. And sure enough, we can. We go to the source and we go to styles, and we have a list of all the styles that we can use. Let's go ahead and try solarized dark. So we'll go to our code and replace this with solarized dark. We'll save that, and great. Now we can easily differentiate the different parts of our code. Now this is looking great, except for one thing. There's this extra space at the bottom. So let's go ahead and inspect that, and we'll see that it's this before thing, and it's adding an extra space to the content. If we remove it, then it looks much better. I don't know why that's there, but the important thing is that I know how we can remove it. All right, so we'll go to our MarkdownDisplay component, and in our style, so we'll be wanting the code : before, and there we'll want for the content to be equal to just an empty string. And we'll go ahead and put that as important because we're doing it just inside this scope, and so we don't have to worry too much about it messing other stuff up. And so now we'll look and inspect, and it is not catching. Interesting. And so the reason it's not catching is because we've scoped it. This is not actually part of our component. It's in a child component. And if we remove scoped, then we'll see that it works. But we don't want to remove scoped. If we remove scoped, then anywhere there's a code block, then it'll remove that extra space before it. And I'm sure there's a reason that it's in there somewhere. And so how are we going to make this work? Well, we can use the : v-deep operator. And so that will basically say, for this one rule, not the other rules in this component CSS, just for this one rule, we will apply this to the child components. And so, importantly, it's not global. It's just for the child components of this component. And there we go, it's working. So here's the set of changes that we made in this section. It's a relatively small number of lines, but they're powerful, and because they're in the MarkdownDisplay component, they'll be used every time we display Markdown in our app. We've got our Markdown displaying nicely for our users, but what about our admin users? So when we're editing, we'll see that these text areas are barely big enough for the tiny description and code summaries that we have right now. And we have to transform this in our head into what it's going to look like in Markdown. It'll be much better if the computer could do that for us. So let's edit our code to make it a little bit better. So we'll start with putting in a Markdown display, and we'll just feed it as the Markdown. We'll feed it the video.code summary. And we're starting with that one because it's just a little bit flashier. And we'll have to, of course, import that component as well. All right, we'll see that the Markdown is showing up, and when we edit it, then it's updating. It would be a little bit better if we could see it side by side. So let's go ahead and do that. The benefits of this are that it would more clearly associate this with this, and it wouldn't take up so much vertical room, while it would be using some of this horizontal room that we're not making great use of right now. Okay, and so for this, we can use the vRow and vColumn combination. So we'll wrap these both in a vRow, and then we'll put a vColumn around each of these, and we'll have it a default of 12, but small or larger will be 6. And so what this means is in a row, there are 12 columns. What cols equal 12 means is that this vColumn will take up all 12 of those columns. SM equals 6 means that when it's a little bit bigger, it'll only take up 6 of those columns, or half of them. All right, so now they're displaying side by side. And let's go ahead and make this a little bit larger. And so in our vText area, we can do that by setting the rows equal to 12. The rows are 5 by default. This is much better. I feel like there's room to see, almost an entire function if we set it in there. And maybe we'll expand it later once we get even more complex stuff we want to put in here. But 12 is nice and roomy for now. So I'm really liking how this looks compared to how we had it before. Now we need to apply it to the description. Rather than typing all of that out again, let's go ahead and copy it and paste it here, and then just replace the vText area with the vText area for the description. And we will, of course, have to replace the Markdown here that's displayed. But then everything else should work. All right, great. We'll make a couple small adjustments, such as upping the number of rows, but this is pretty much how we'll want it to look. And we can also go ahead and save the video and see that the changes we made, such as these exclamation points, are being saved. So everything's great. The issue is that this is a lot of repeated code. However, when I tried to make the Markdown editor component that encapsulated all of this, I did run into a lot of complexities that don't have a whole lot to do with Markdown. And so I'm going to do that in a separate video. Here's what we've done today. We've installed the marked package and then used it to compile and display Markdown. Then we created a MarkdownDisplay Component that makes it a lot easier to use and provides a single place where we can put in further complexity. Complexity such as highlighting. So we added the highlight.js library, and then we processed it and applied styles. That made the code in our Markdown much easier to read. And then finally, we created a much more visually appealing interface for editing Markdown. However, our code for editing is a little bit messy. And so we'd like to make it so instead of having to do all this every time we want to edit a Markdown field, we'd like something like this, where we can just feed in our data and a couple other options, and that's it. So the video where we do that should be coming out very soon. If it's not out yet, go ahead and click the subscribe button and hit the notification bell to make sure you don't miss a video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.